Right. Claire, we're going to wait a little while for more people
Yeah.
to join, and then we will start the conversation.
Oh,
Because
good.
I think you brought us some very interesting topics for the day. So that's going to be interesting to learn from you. But I see still people coming in, so we're waiting for a
That's
couple
great.
more seconds, and then we will start.
It's at that time of day where people are starting to do bits and pieces and now having to pull themselves away from things to get back into this. So understandable that it's taking people a little moment to get on board.
All right, so let's get started here. Welcome everybody to the another webinar from the IR Club on Cometis. Happy to welcome you. Today we have a really interesting topic and a very prominent and experienced speaker at our conferences. I'm happy to welcome Claire Lavery. For you to get a little intro about Claire, for those who don't know her, Claire's the founder of Lavery Associates, and she and her team is highly specialized on investor perception research. They're completely independent and free of conflict of interest. And many of you probably know Claire from her previous role where she built Revell Research in Europe and the Asia Pacific region. And Claire's experience advising companies on their investor programs, investor relations programs, and how to measure it. Now, Claire, and I almost forgot that she has 7 years served in the IR Society in the UK. So I can definitely say we have a very competent speaker here today. Claire, companies are spending hundreds of thousands of euros for their IR programs. And you're going to talk about how to measure the effectiveness of an IR program. We're really interested to learn about that. Before we go into the details from your side, everybody, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. I will then, bring them up to Claire. I will turn off my camera in a second and leave the space for Claire. And whenever there is a question, I turn on the camera and then we will have a discussion. Claire, happy to hear what you have to tell us. Please, over to
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Very much appreciated. And my thanks to, obviously, to Michael, to Patrick, to the IR Club Cometis for hosting this event and this session. For those of you that don't know me, I've actually participated in a number of IR Club events over the years. I was just, Michael and I were talking before, and in fact, it wasn't the first one, it was the second IR Club conference. So we're talking about 10 years ago, which is quite some time. Anyway, I'm delighted to be back, and this is even more special for me because I recently set up my own business, as Michael mentioned, Lavery Associates. So special thanks to Patrick and Michael for their support and their friendship, and actually to the German IR community for always being so welcoming. So as Michael mentioned, my career has been in investor relations for quite some time. I actually started out my career with IR Magazine and then joined the US investor perception study provider Revell to build and grow its European division, which I did over a 10-year period, gaining fantastic experience working with a wide range of clients across all geographies, industries, and market caps. So I've seen a lot. During this time, I also sat on the board of the UK IR Society for 7 years, as Michael mentioned there. And there I organized the annual conference for many years, so can relate and empathize with Michael and Patrick in organizing their events, and participated on the best practice committee as well. After leaving Revell, I took a little bit of time out and then spent some time with Sedali & Co. But ultimately, setting up my own business was something that I always wanted to do. So I very recently made the leap and launched Lavery Associates. And we're about a month old at the minute. So it's been pedal to the metal and we're doing really well. So it's fantastic. But in terms of what we actually do, and Michael has touched on this, we're a completely independent, conflict-free investor perception study provider, positioned to empower management teams to make smarter decisions that they can truly stand by to help drive valuation and mitigate risk. So I want to kick things off with actually a piece of data from my old company, Ravel, because it offers great context and validation for why we're all here today. It addresses the value of IR. This is a question that Ravel had been asking for many years of the buy side. And simply put, what do you think IR is worth? Now, of course, this can vary company to company depending on what's happening. But overall, the investment community believes superb IR can account for a premium of up to 10% of a company's valuation. And poor IR can account for a discount of up to 20% of a company's valuation. That 30% delta, that's significant, and one that should not only be at the forefront of every IRO's mind, but also everyone else in the company, particularly for those that are investor facing, because essentially they can help or hinder that impact. Now, before we get into a review of how you assess your IR program, I'd like to reflect on 2 points. Firstly, who's actually involved in investor relations? Who are the key players? Because this is not a one person or a one team effort. A truly successful IR program, well, it involves a whole host of people and teams. Granted, some people and teams are more key than others because, as I mentioned, they're investor facing. An obvious example would be your CEO and CFO. Granted, you might be responsible for IR, but ultimately the CEO and the CFO are responsible for the company's performance, not you. And I would say in some cases, you're probably pretty glad about that. It's not necessarily a job a lot of people would like. PR, corporate communications, well, they're also responsible, and it's imperative that IR and PR in corporate comms work hand in hand together, especially in today's world where the pace of news flow is just so much faster and diverse. As investors aim to learn more about companies in an attempt to determine their level of confidence in management being able to deliver, they're increasingly seeking and appreciating access to board members. However, it is important to make sure that your board members, whether it be members of the board of management, so outside the CEO and the CFO, or members of your supervisory board, you just need to make sure that they're on message, as well as being capable and prepared to engage with investors. Bottom line, without these people and these teams on the slide that we have here, IR simply doesn't work. And as such, everyone then carries the responsibility. Now, with that said, that brings me to my second point. And I want to be really realistic here and consider what is actually in your control. And I mean the investor relations officer, and what's outside your control. Now, I would recommend that if you're starting a new IR job, that you use this slide or a version of it when you sit down and discuss the plan ahead, what it's going to look like with management, because this is going to really go a long way in helping go a long way in management's expectations, and just the overall relationship. Even if you've been in your job for a while, I would still use it as an opportunity to reset. Use it as a way to, or a means to, framing how you learn from your peers. You've been looking at what best-in-class IROs do to ensure the IR function works effectively. It is an opportunity to do a reset. Now, you're not reneging on responsibilities here in any shape or form. You're just better managing them for the good of the company and its shareholders. So as an IRO, you can control who you tell your story to and how well the investment community knows your story. You can provide management with investor feedback. That's in your control. And you can control your own level of candor and, of course, your responsiveness. But the message has to be owned by management. An IRO can help shape it, but what investors want and what potential investors get Well, so, thinking about your levels of disclosure and transparency, these are the things that IROs can only really influence. And even then, ultimately, management decide on IRO's level of influence within that realm as well. And despite what C-suite thinks, or anybody else for that matter, IROs have zero control over the macro issues, the stock price, and the sell side ratings, which should be a relief to most. But unfortunately, it's a hard message to drive home because you guys are normally the first to, whenever they've got questions about the share price, obviously. But understanding these dynamics from the outset really saves a huge amount of time and creates just better alignment internally, which is then also apparent to the investment community. Now, obviously, measuring the effectiveness of an investor relations program is essential for understanding how well the company is communicating with investors, managing its reputation, and supporting its overall financial goals. And whilst there could be many more metrics and tools, I think these 9 combined allow for a good core assessment of the effectiveness of an IR program. And I'm quite aware, I'm not sharing anything with you guys that you don't already know here, but I would urge you to consider this as simply a reminder or a refresh as you begin to plan for the year ahead. It's a good time. We're rolling into the last quarter, so you guys will be thinking about your plans for the year ahead. But let's take a look at each, and I'll share some thoughts, examples, tips, recommendations as I go through. So if you want to know how effective your IR program is, my advice is to ask your shareholders. But before you do this, examine your level of engagement, as this will give you a picture of what to expect. So who are you engaging with? How often and by what means? Measure participation rates in earnings calls, shareholder meetings, capital markets days, roadshows, etc. Benchmark yourselves and understand what your peers are doing. Even take it a step further and understand what the best performing companies are doing. If this information isn't accessible through your current platforms, reach out to those companies and ask them directly. I think you'll find that they're pretty forthcoming and there's a good community wanting to share best practice out there. Remember, if you're not fully engaged with your investors or your potential investors, your company will struggle to stay on their radar, or perhaps even more damagingly, they'll make up their own story about you, which could be far from the truth and really damaging then to the share price. Assess to what extent you're engaging with your secondary investors as well. What are you doing with regards to targeting new investors? Are you reaching beyond your own country? Do you need to adjust your narrative to appeal to non-domestic investors? How do you differentiate versus peers? What are you doing differently to reach your target audience versus those peers? So track the frequency, the nature, the outcomes of your investor meetings, and that includes investor calls, one-on-one meetings with management, the one-on-one meetings that you guys are having as well, and of course as well your investor conferences too. Engagement, Michael, I see you popped up. Have you got a question there?
Yes, there's one question coming up here. Can you give us a good number of attendees in an investor call for an average mid-cap company?
In terms of the investors or you mean from an IR perspective?
From investors in the investor calls.
In the investor calls, it tends to differ depending on geography. If you are dealing with the UK and continental Europe, you'll find there's less people in the room and they have generally more autonomy to make decisions. Okay, so it could just maybe be a couple of people. Although I think increasingly over the years, that number has maybe increased a little bit. If you're dealing with US investors, just a different environment, you will have more people in the room. There's less autonomy in that decision-making process. So you could have maybe 4 or 5 people in the room, depending. But it really depends on, as you pointed out, maybe the market cap, the size of fund that you're talking to as well. But there is a slight difference in terms of the sort of the level of autonomy and just the number of people that are involved in the decision making process there as well.
Thank you.
No problem. So I was saying about engagement. So engagement is a two-way street, and I would also say feel free to ask for feedback. For example, if you have a target investor that you've been talking to for a while, but for whatever reason they just haven't taken a position, and you may understand elements of why that is, but maybe not quite comprehensively why they're still holding back. Ask them, ask them, what more do you need to know to initiate a position? So use that opportunity, but obviously use it wisely. For a more organized route, most good CRM systems have a feedback mechanism. For example, Engage, which operates out of the UK, but I think it is certainly European-wide, perhaps global now as well. But so that's a useful company to take a look at. But if you have a CRM that offers you the functionality and you aren't already using it, please start. If it doesn't have that functionality, I would suggest find an alternative, or you could do it yourself. Use SurveyMonkey. This is something you can manage internally amongst the team, or outsource it to a platform like Quantifier, who specialize in getting feedback post meetings and events like that. Whatever your approach, though, whatever option you go for, select, do it wisely, as I mentioned there. The last thing investors want is each time they engage with you is to be forensically assessed about their thoughts and their views of the meeting. So my advice is to keep it short, keep it painless. Ideally, I would recommend maybe 2 to 3 closed-ended questions. So what I mean by closed-ended questions is ask them to rate something on a scale of 1 to 6, etc. Or it's a yes, no, maybe, or something like that question. And then one open-ended question. Okay, any more than this, you're going to run the risk of basically frustrating them and they won't participate. One word of caution with regards to feedback is to be aware of the drawbacks. There's really 3 factors that I would suggest that you keep in your minds. The first is you will lose the anonymity aspect. So the feedback is then going to be less forthcoming and less candid when it's attributable and you know who's saying what. Secondly, the level of participation. It's going to be less, and therefore it may not necessarily be in a situation where you can collate statistically meaningful data as well. So is it robust enough to make decisions? I would say not. So be very cautious around that particular aspect of it. And then I think third and finally, you and management will invariably be more tempted to be led by those that shout the loudest. It's a human nature reaction, or maybe those that are your larger shareholders. But you then run the risk of potentially disregarding the voice of the silent majority. So keep those 3 sort of drawbacks in your mind as you think about how you pursue your feedback activities. Either way, it's better to gather feedback than not. Just do it smartly, painlessly, and consistently. And perhaps even more importantly, consider what you do with it once you've collected it. Track it, learn from it, and definitely don't neglect it. While stock performance is not in your control, as we've talked about already, it is the go-to measurement for all concerned. Although for some, I think there's probably more chance of it giving you a heart attack in some situations. But of course, it must be monitored. But with continued volatility, just really being the new norm, and hedge funds driving stocks up and down, it's important to always consider it in context. And this is where feedback and research play a key role in providing the necessary color and context. Being proactive with your feedback and your research mechanisms, and I'll talk about research in a moment, that allows you to get ahead of matters. It helps provide management and the board with the reasoning and certainty behind what's happening with the share price. Finally, on this topic, analyst ratings, with the overall quality of the sell side not being what it once was, this has become tricky for some, but be sure to keep abreast of not only the number of analysts that are covering you, but the quality of their coverage. As mentioned, this is something that you can influence, but you cannot control, because much of it depends on management and, of course, the company's performance, not to mention what else might be going on in the world and from an industry perspective. Equally, though, I would say neglect this group at your peril. It is absolutely vital to keep them on side. Give them the access to management as a group, perhaps on a regular basis, breakfast sessions online where you're able to get them all together, and it's good, effective use of management's time. And think about other ways of feeding them information, perhaps the use of video, etc., to help them better understand how your company is going to achieve its strategic goals. Essentially, that's the essence of what they want to get to, just the same way as investors. And I think this will also help balance their tendency to think more short term than longer term then as well. So many years ago, I remember a leading IRO saying that corporate communications and PR should report into IR. And I think many would agree with him today, particularly given the rise of social media and the general increase in news flow and how we consume news and just information more generally. Whatever the situation in your company, you need to work seamlessly, of course, with corporate communications, PR, monitoring the media, track volume and sentiment relating to your company. Positive neutral coverage can reflect effective IR and corporate communications, and not surprisingly, negative coverage could highlight communication gaps. So really reflect on that as well and make sure that it's aligned with what's going on in both those areas of the business between IR and corporate comms. Monitor social media. Most companies now engage in what they call social listening, especially if they have retail investors to whatever degree. If you're not doing this already, talk to your corporate communications team about it internally, talk to your communications agencies as well. But this is definitely something that needs to be monitored quite comprehensively as well. And it's just obviously vital to be across all communication channels to really make sure that you're controlling the narrative effectively. When it comes to press releases and news flow, consider how often and how effectively your company is engaging with the media. Is the message clear? Is it aligned with investors' interests? Now, granted, the media is always looking for a story, and we all know that bad news sells, but keep them on side, just the same way that I was mentioning with the sell side. Use them to your advantage, as this can really have either a conscious or a subconscious impact on the investment community. So what I would suggest when it comes to your investor base and your shareholder register is make sure that you are doing a regular review of the breakdown of your investor base by institution, retail, I just mentioned there, the investment style, geography, sector. A diverse base could indicate successful outreach and communication efforts. I would also consider, do you have the right investors? Do you have the investors you want? Or do you have the investors you deserve? I recall a UK FTSE 100 company that I worked with. In 2015, they had a lot of value investors. They had a whole bunch of issues which were pretty well documented at the time in the public domain. But it really, the bottom line was that investors didn't know if they could get back on track and get back to delivering growth. There was a new management team. They had to rebuild the credibility of management, the credibility of the company, and prove that they could deliver on those goals. But long story short, as a result of consistently delivering and keeping their messaging on point, they managed to slowly but surely attract more GARP-orientated investors, and in time, growth investors as well. And they were able to monitor this whole process through their investor perception research coupled with their shareholder analysis. And they were able to track this progress in an incredibly helpful way to management and the board to allow them to also monitor it over time. And sometimes you will see that happen actually quicker than you'll see the improvement in the share price. So it's actually giving management and the board something to hang their hat on whilst they wait for that share price improvement, which may take a little bit longer to catch up. So my advice is to do regular shareholder ID if you're not doing them already. Analysis of this information is really proof to the extent to which your messages are resonating, and it will highlight pockets of opportunity, whether it be the type of investor, geography, or sector for you to focus on going forward. Plus, it will also allow you the opportunity to manage risk because you're obviously going to be looking out for any activist activity as well that might be gathering some momentum. In terms of retention and attrition rates, hi, Michael.
Claire, can you give any recommendation for databases for the investor profiles?
Well, I mean, there's the key players in terms of shareholder ID. I mean, NASDAQ do it. S&P, I think also some of the banks will do them as well. I'm probably forgetting some too. I think Sedali & Co. also have a platform that they're developing. So there's a bunch of different ones out there. And they will either use, I think most of them tend to use FactSet or something like that in terms of feeding that data to make sure that it's up to date. But I would make sure that it's, a lot of people will depend on how regular that they're doing it. They may do it on a monthly basis. They may do it on a quarterly basis. They may do it once a year in doing that analysis with the companies. But it really depends on what's going on with the company and also that the industry that you're operating in. I would perhaps. I'm hesitating because I'm thinking if you do it too regularly, you may end up getting a little bit too hung up on it. And these things take a little bit of time to evolve. So I would probably manage your own expectations around it as well as an IRO so that it's you're not sort of getting into that trap of short-term thinking yourselves. It's trying to create some balance to it too.
Thank you.
In terms of retention and attrition rates, of course, these are key as well. So track stability, the turnover of major shareholders. This is obviously relatable as well to engagement and feedback and research and stock performance. And it goes without saying, high retention could suggest that your IR program is successful, nurturing long-term relationships, but that's on the basis that you have the right type of investors. While of course turnover may be due to dissatisfaction or poor engagement. But that point about do you have the right investors or do you have the investors you deserve will really have a big impact on what that share register looks like. So in terms of earnings calls and the metrics around that, you can tell the extent to which the investment community is interested and engaged when you look at the metrics of earnings calls, results calls. From their questions, you will be able to tell how prepared they are and the degree to which they're actually listening. Even if you think about the results call itself, I think this is actually reflective of any type of event. We're all living in an online environment. Are they jumping on just for the Q&A? Have they read the release, or have they actually spent the time listening to what management has said on that results call or at that event before they get to the actual Q&A piece? Post-call, examine the questions. Do they indicate the understanding of the business or not? If you keep getting the same questions, the investment community is clearly not satisfied with the answers they're getting. So how can you address that going forward? Are management offering enough transparency, color, context in their answers? Track all of that information to help refine your communications and your activities going forward. So regulatory compliance adherence. This is the stuff that you must do. My plea is don't fall short at the first hurdle, and absolutely make sure that your information is easily accessible. If I'm an investor, I don't want to have to dig through your website to find information. 2 clicks and I should have it. It should be complete and it should be correct. Don't give investors the cause for a concern unnecessarily. So don't fall at the first hurdle and make sure this stuff is locked in. I mentioned earlier about understanding what others do in regard to their levels of engagement. And I would definitely encourage benchmarking as much as possible. So for example, your IR activities, shareholder returns, or your engagement levels versus peers in the same industry and sector, as I'd suggested. And that other point about also trying to compare your efforts versus your market cap peers and overall best performing companies globally. Don't settle for, oh, it's okay, we're doing what our peers are doing. That's great. But you also have to remember the average number of stocks that a buy-sider covers is about 124. One, you need to get on their radar, and 2, you need to stay on their radar. Doing just what's the normal thing to do isn't necessarily going to get you to stay the journey on that radar. You really need to try and differentiate yourselves. So hence my suggestion about looking at what the best performing companies are doing. And they could be larger cap companies with bigger budgets, but there might be things, certain things that maybe don't cost a lot or cost anything that you guys could be doing as well. And vice versa, large caps are in the, large caps and above, they're in the routine of doing things in particular ways, but there's some great innovation coming out of small cap, mid cap companies with fantastic IR programs and IROs. So I think there's learnings from both sides. But either way, this will help you identify areas that your program is excelling or where you can improve if you have benchmarking included there. And a great place to turn for this is Extel, and there's other people obviously do benchmarking as well, but I think Extel is a good place to start with that type of information. Now, I could probably spend a whole session focused on this particular topic alone, but I'll keep it brief and of course welcome any follow-up discussions after this session or later on down the road. Essentially, this is the ultimate assessment of measuring the effectiveness of your IR program, but it should be done in tandem with everything else that we've touched on so far. In my experience, I would recommend that you do an investor perception study, investor perception research, either once a year or once every 2 years as best practice. depending on what's happening with the company, and so on. Longer than any 3 years, I would say you probably lose the opportunity to capture valuable insights in between. And it's really about ensuring that you have the insights and the certainty to help you see around the corner, see further down the road. With carefully crafted questions, this is really your complete diagnostic, but it must be done correctly. Otherwise, it's a waste of time and it won't teach you or management anything that you don't know already. And in fact, it probably will put management off the entire idea completely. So you'll always struggle to get it back on their agenda again, and certainly get budget for it for that matter as well. First and foremost, it is important to understand the difference between feedback and research. Feedback is largely anecdotal. It's hard to determine what's noise and what you actually need to be listening to. Research is about going deeper and wider, so developing a comprehensive line of inquiry and interviewing a representative sample of your universe. And what I mean by that is talking to your top owners. They are, of course, key, but also talking to your second tier holders, your targets, your underweights, the sell side as well. And in fact, for some, interview management and board as well, asking the questions that you pose to the investment community, ask those to the management team and the board, in terms of looking to see to what degree there's alignment between each of the audiences. So we're applying a methodology to really ideally capture the vocal minority, but also to give a voice to the silent majority and avoid the risk of bias and hidden agendas. Plus, by interviewing a more representative sample, it means it's possible then to quantify your results so that you can get a hard measurement to help provide management with certainty, as opposed to being in a situation where it's, I think, I feel about certain situations. This will also allow you, the quantification piece, it will allow you to identify if there might be any communication gaps as well. And it allows you as well to establish your benchmark so that you can effectively track and measure things over time too. It should also be independent. The independence is absolutely key. Making sure that you do have a provider that doesn't have a vested interest in the results is what's going to ultimately empower management to get behind the results and then make those smarter decisions in an effort to drive shareholder value and mitigate future risk. The whole mindset around this work is to be proactive rather than reactive, and really to get ahead of the issues before they become problems. Not only is this the ultimate service to measure the effectiveness of your investor relations program, it is a fantastic risk management tool. And it really sends a positive message to the market that you care about what they think and that you will respond accordingly. And with that, I come to a close and welcome any other questions that you guys might have.
Thank you, Claire. So please enter your questions into the Q&A sessions. But in the meantime, Claire, I want to know, maybe you want to stop sharing your screen so we can all focus on you. From my experience, especially in the small and mid-cap market, many CEOs simply or purely focus on the development on the share price. What advice can you give to investor relations teams on how to convince the board to do a more structured approach on investor relations?
I think it is. I think there's probably a couple of things, Michael. I think with the board and with the management team, it's the risk of what happens if you don't do it, if you're not across all of this in a sort of forensic way? I think that there's I would probably present it more as a risk management tool. So even if things are going well with the company, you want to be able to maintain that. So you really want to get ahead, as I say, on issues before they actually become problems. And to be able, and then if you know things are maybe struggling, you want to get to the heart of things and make sure that your efforts are pointed in the right direction and that you're able to prioritize your communications effectively, so that there's no misguidedness in terms of what you're actually communicating with the market. It's all about making sure that you have absolute certainty. And I think the other thing as well is that, you know, we're increasingly in this environment where it's just a short-term lens and it's really hard to get past that. It's very difficult for companies to talk about that longer term picture. So by doing this type of diagnostic across the board, and having the insights, it's putting you in control of your narrative, and actually giving you the right then to talk about the longer term picture. So I think it's quite intangible, those types of things, and there is a lot of convincing to be done, but it's really about sowing a seed of risk, if you will, or what that could, how that could play out and impact, but also, all these companies have strategic plans. They're not necessarily getting the opportunity to talk about them as much as they should be talking about it in today's environment. So whatever you can do internally to examine your situation, examine it versus your peers, your market cap, and having that information is going to put you in a better position to be able to then adjust and refine your communications to be able to talk about that longer term picture.
Now that you've been and are talking to probably thousands of investors, through all the clients you advise, what is the biggest criticism the investors have on the IR programs from clients?
It's interesting. I've had a number of studies where it's been a case of, and no disrespect to the CEOs and the CFOs out there in this world, but I've had a number of situations where the problem is less IR, it's more the management team. And that's why I started off with that particular slide at the beginning, because it's not just, Mr. or Mrs. IR and the IR team and their team. It's actually the whole unit, including management as well. The biggest thing that comes back from investors time and time again is not so much about disclosure, but more about a lack of transparency. And the investment community differ between the two. Disclosure, as I mentioned in the slides, that's the stuff that you have to do. You're obliged to provide the market with that information. Transparency is something less tangible. It's more about communicating how you're going to achieve your strategic goals, your strategic initiatives. And that's the piece that they will perhaps criticize more often than not, the IR program of maybe not doing as much of that as possible. But again, IR can only influence that, because essentially that's where management, as I said, needs to own the message. So investors are thinking, okay, do I believe them? Do I like what they're saying? And do I have confidence in their ability to achieve this? Have they laid out the roadmap with the milestones for me to be able to monitor this progress over time and give me that color and context?
Okay, so can you give us a price range for your services? What does it, cost from to if somebody wants to do a, investor perception research with Levery?
So, God, that sounds awful. Talking about money at this point, I would say you can have there's something for everybody, right, in terms of budget, Michael. I think the focus probably needs to be a little bit more on what you want to achieve with it and at what level. So you can have something that's quite light touch, but then it's about being very focused about what you expect to get from that. And then you can have something that is very precise, very comprehensive, that is really going to help, I guess, drive the IR program going forward, because it's going to help you prioritize your whole priorities going forward. So I would say from a financial perspective, you're looking at anything from maybe 30,000 euros through to maybe 80,000 euros and upwards. But it really depends on different components, the groups that are being interviewed, the line of inquiry, so many different factors that are in play. But that's your big sort of comprehensive work. But again, all these other things, making sure that you're getting that regular feedback, doing that on a quarterly basis, doing that following your road shows and whatever, that can be done then as well. But I would suggest that do your feedback on a regular basis and then look at doing your investor perception work perhaps once a year, once every 2 years, once every 3 years. But longer than that, as I say, you're going to lose sentiment in between.
All right, we're good in time. I see there are no further questions here. Thank you very much, Claire. It's been wonderful to have you in our program. And if there are any more questions, please contact Claire directly so that we can help you with your questions.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody else for listening. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.